The morning air was crisp in downtown Phoenix as I pulled up to Desert Storage Solutions. October in Arizona meant the heat was finally bearable, but the sun still beat down mercilessly on the concrete lot where about 30 people had gathered for the monthly storage unit auction. I'd been doing this for 3 years now, buying abandoned storage units and reselling whatever treasures I could find in my small antique shop. Business had been slow lately, and I was down to my last $800. "All right, folks, gather round," called out Jim Martinez, the auctioneer. He was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been running these auctions longer than anyone could remember. "Unit 247 is up first. Owner's been delinquent for 18 months. You get 5 minutes to look, but you can't touch anything or step inside." I watched as the crowd shuffled toward the roll-up door. These auctions always drew the same mix. Professional buyers like myself, curious retirees looking for adventure, and opportunists hoping to strike it rich. The competition could be fierce, especially when Carl Brennan showed up. Carl owned 3 pawn shops across the valley and had deep pockets. He was here today, standing near the front with his usual smirk. Jim yanked up the metal door with a loud screech. The afternoon sunlight flooded into the 10x15 unit, revealing what looked like the remnants of someone's entire life crammed into a concrete box. Old furniture was stacked haphazardly, a dining room table with mismatched chairs, a leather couch with visible wear, boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom in faded marker. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. "Looks like Grandma's attic exploded in there," someone behind me muttered. I studied the contents carefully. There was an old oak dresser that might be worth something, and I spotted what looked like a vintage radio on a shelf. But mostly, it was exactly what everyone else saw, the accumulated possessions of someone who could no longer afford to keep them. 5 minutes, Jim announced, starting his timer. The crowd pressed closer to the opening, everyone trying to get a better look. Carl was taking photos with his phone, probably cataloging anything that caught his eye. I noticed an elderly woman in a floral dress examining everything with the intensity of an appraiser. "See anything good, Mark?" asked Betty Walsh, a regular who usually bid on the smaller units. She was in her 70s and treated these auctions like a social event. "Hard to tell from here," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. The truth was I'd spotted something interesting, a heavy-looking trunk pushed against the back wall. It was partially hidden behind the dining table, but from what I could see, it appeared to be made of solid wood with metal reinforcements. Those kinds of trunks sometimes contained valuable items that people forgot about when they stored them away. "Time's up," Jim called out. "Let's start the bidding at $50. Hands shot up around me. 50, 75, 100. I waited, watching the early bidders drop out as the price climbed. At $200, it was down to Carl, the elderly woman, and a younger man I didn't recognize. $250, Carl called out confidently. The elderly woman shook her head and stepped back. The younger man hesitated, then raised his hand. $300. Carl's eyes narrowed. He was used to intimidating other bidders, but this guy wasn't backing down. $400, $450, the young man countered without hesitation. I could see Carl calculating whether it was worth pushing higher. At these prices, he'd need to find some really valuable items to make a profit. The contents looked like standard household goods, nothing obviously antique or collectible. 500, Carl announced, his voice carrying a note of finality. The young man looked around nervously, then shook his head. "I'm out." "Anyone else?" Jim scanned the crowd. "Going once? Going twice?" This was my moment. I'd been in this business long enough to know when to take a calculated risk. That trunk in the back was calling to me, and at $500 I could still make money if there was anything decent inside. 600, I called out. Every head turned toward me. Carl's face darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged by someone he considered small time. 700, Carl shot back immediately. My heart was pounding. 700 was most of my remaining cash, but something about that storage unit felt different. Maybe it was the way the trunk was positioned, almost deliberately hidden. Maybe it was just desperation making me bold. 800, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Carl stared at me for a long moment. The crowd was silent, waiting to see what he'd do. Finally, he shook his head in disgust. "It's all yours, Thompson. Hope you enjoy your junk." "Sold to Mark Thompson for $800, Jim announced. "Unit's yours, Mark. You've got until closing time to clear it out." As the crowd dispersed toward the next unit, I felt a mix of elation and terror. I'd just spent almost everything I had on what everyone else, including Carl, thought was worthless junk. Betty patted me on the shoulder as she walked past. "Hope you know something the rest of us don't," she said with a wink. I looked back at my purchase, already planning how I'd move everything out. I'd rented a truck for the day, anticipating a win, but now I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Little did I know that in a few hours, I'd be staring at something that would make my heart race faster than any auction ever had. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated possessions, waiting in that heavy trunk I'd noticed, was a secret that would change everything. But first, I had to get through the rest of the bidding and figure out how to move a storage unit's worth of junk before sunset. 3 hours later, I was questioning every life decision that had led me to this moment. The Arizona sun was relentless, even in October, and I was drenched in sweat as I loaded box after box into my rented truck. Most of the contents were exactly what they appeared to be: old clothes that smelled of mothballs, kitchen appliances from the 1990s, and photo albums filled with strangers' memories. "Need some help there, Mark?" I turned to see Danny Reeves, a kid from the neighborhood who sometimes helped me move heavy items for $20. He was 19, all arms and legs, but stronger than he looked. "Danny, thank God," I panted, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Yeah, I could use a hand. There's some heavy stuff in the back I can't move alone." We'd already cleared most of the front section, the dining table, chairs, and several boxes of books. The leather couch had been a nightmare to maneuver, but we'd managed to get it onto the truck. Now all that remained was that trunk I'd noticed during the viewing, plus a few items stacked behind it. "What's in this thing?" Danny grunted as we tried to slide the trunk forward. "Feels like it's full of rocks." The trunk was indeed incredibly heavy, much heavier than any piece of furniture had a right to be. It was made of dark wood with brass corners and a substantial lock that looked original. The whole thing measured about 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 18 inches tall. As we struggled to move it even a few inches, I started to wonder what could possibly be inside. "Maybe old books," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. "You know how heavy books can be when you get enough of them together." Danny gave me a skeptical look. "Books don't usually weigh this much, Mr. Thompson. This feels like, I don't know, like metal or something." We managed to get the trunk to the storage unit entrance, but there was no way we were lifting it into the truck without help. I looked around the facility and spotted Miguel, one of the maintenance workers, smoking a cigarette near the office. "Miguel," I called out, "you got a dolly I could borrow?" "Sure thing, Mark," he replied, crushing out his cigarette. "You win something good today." "Jury's still out on that," I said honestly. Miguel returned with a heavy-duty dolly, the kind they used for moving appliances. Even with the wheeled assistance, it took all 3 of us to get the trunk positioned and secured. The dolly's wheels groaned under the weight as we rolled it toward my truck. "Jesus, Mark," Miguel said, shaking his head. "What did you buy, a safe?" That comment stopped me cold. A safe. I hadn't thought of that possibility, but it would explain the weight and the substantial construction. People sometimes stored safes in storage units, especially if they were moving or renovating. But if it was a safe, that raised new questions, like what might be inside and whether I'd need a locksmith to open it. "Could be," I admitted. "Guess I'll find out when I get it back to the shop." Loading it into the truck required a ramp and all our combined strength. By the time we got it secured, the sun was starting to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I paid Danny his $20 and added an extra 10 for the heavy lifting. "You going to open it tonight?" he asked, his curiosity evident. "Probably tomorrow," I said. "I need to get all this stuff back and sorted first." The drive back to my shop took 20 minutes through Phoenix's early evening traffic. My antique store, Thompson's Treasures, was located in a strip mall that had seen better days, squeezed between a tax preparation service and a pizza place that changed owners every year. It wasn't much, but the rent was affordable, and I had a storage room in the back where I could work on restoration projects. Unloading took another hour. Most items went directly into storage. I'd sort through everything properly over the next few days. But that trunk I wanted in my workshop immediately. I called Danny again, offering him another 20 to help me get it inside and positioned where I could work on it. "You're really curious about this thing, aren't you?" Danny observed as we maneuvered it through the back door. "Wouldn't you be?" We set it down in the center of my workshop, under the bright LED lights I'd installed last year. In the good lighting, I could see details that hadn't been visible in the storage unit. The wood was definitely old, probably early to mid-20th century, with a rich patina that spoke of quality craftsmanship. The brass fittings were tarnished but solid, and that lock looked serious. After Danny left, I spent 20 minutes just examining the trunk from every angle. There was no manufacturer's mark that I could find, no nameplate or identifying stamps. The lock appeared to be original, a heavy brass mechanism that would definitely require either a key or the services of a locksmith. I tried lifting one corner just to confirm what I already knew. The thing was ridiculously heavy. If it was full of books or papers, they were the heaviest books in history. If it was clothing or household items, they were made of lead. Standing there in my workshop, surrounded by the familiar smells of wood polish and metal cleaner, I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. In 3 years of buying storage units, I'd found some interesting things. A collection of vintage baseball cards that sold for $200, an original oil painting by a local artist that fetched $800, once even a genuine Rolex watch that someone had forgotten in a jewelry box. But I'd never found anything that felt this significant, this mysterious, this potentially life-changing. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the trunk from different angles. Tomorrow I'd start researching. Maybe I could find out something about its origins online, or at least get an idea of what I was dealing with. But tonight I just wanted to sit with it, to let my imagination run wild about what secrets it might contain. As I locked up the shop and headed home to my small apartment across town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something big. Call it intuition, call it wishful thinking. But that trunk felt different from anything I'd ever bought at auction. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined as I drove through the Phoenix night, was that inside that innocuous-looking wooden box lay something that would make my wildest dreams seem small. Something that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about luck, about secrets, and about how quickly a person's entire life could change. But first, I had to figure out how to open it, and that was going to require help from someone I'd hoped never to see again. The next morning, I stood in my workshop staring at the trunk while nursing my second cup of coffee. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with possibilities. In the light of day, my excitement from the previous evening felt a bit foolish. For all I knew, the trunk was filled with old photo albums or someone's rock collection. The weight could be explained by any number of mundane things, but I had to know. I'd already spent an hour online researching antique trunks, trying to identify the manufacturer or approximate age. The style suggested 1920s to 1940s, probably American-made, but beyond that I was guessing. What I really needed was to get it open. That's when I remembered Tommy Castellano. Tommy and I had history, the kind of history I'd been trying to forget for the past 5 years. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood in South Phoenix, got into trouble together as teenagers, and made some questionable decisions in our early 20s. While I'd eventually gone straight, opening my antique shop and building a legitimate business, Tommy had stayed in the grey areas. He wasn't a criminal exactly, but he knew people who were, and he had skills that weren't advertised in the yellow pages, including the ability to open just about any lock ever made. I'd sworn I'd never ask Tommy for another favor after the last time, but as I stared at that brass lock, I realized I didn't have much choice. A locksmith would ask questions, want documentation proving I owned whatever was inside. Tommy would just see it as an interesting puzzle. I found his number in my old contacts, buried under a list I'd labeled "Do Not Call." He answered on the third ring. "Mark Thompson." His gravelly voice came through the speaker. "I'll be damned. Thought you deleted my number years ago. Hey, Tommy, I need a favor." "Don't we all? What kind of favor?" I explained about the storage auction and the locked trunk, keeping the details vague. Tommy listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. "So you want me to pop a lock on something you bought fair and square?" he said when I finished. "Sounds legitimate enough. What's in it for me?" "200 cash, and if there's anything valuable inside, you get 10%. There was a long pause. "Must be some trunk if you're offering that kind of money. When do you want me to look at it?" "How about now? Give me an hour." Tommy Castellano arrived at my shop looking exactly like he had 5 years ago. Same leather jacket, same gold chain, same suspicious eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He was in his mid-30s like me, but life had been harder on him. His dark hair was already showing grey at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we were younger. "Nice place," he said, looking around my shop. "Very legitimate. I'm trying to build something here, Tommy." "I can see that." He spotted the trunk immediately. "That the problem, child?" We walked to the back room together. In the workshop lighting, the trunk looked even more substantial than it had the day before. Tommy circled it slowly, his trained eye taking in details I'd probably missed. "This is quality work," he said, running his fingers along the brass fittings, probably made before World War II, when people still built things to last. See this lock? That's not some cheap luggage hardware. This was designed to keep people out. He knelt down and examined the lock mechanism closely, pulling a small flashlight from his jacket pocket to peer inside the keyhole. Whoever locked this thing meant business. This is a Mosler mechanism, same company that made bank vaults. You don't put a lock like this on a trunk full of old clothes. My heart started beating faster. Can you open it? Can I open it? Tommy smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Mark, you're talking to a man who once got into a 1920s Diebold safe that the fire department couldn't crack. This might take me 20 minutes. He returned to his car and came back with a small leather tool roll. Inside were picks, tension wrenches, and other implements I couldn't identify. Tommy selected a few tools and went to work on the lock with the focused intensity of a surgeon. So what do you think is in there? He asked as he worked, not looking up from the lock. Honestly, I have no idea. Could be anything. Old documents, jewelry, family heirlooms. Could be nothing, Tommy added pragmatically. People lock up weird stuff. I once opened a safe that contained nothing but old tax returns and a collection of salt and pepper shakers. That would be just my luck. Tommy worked in silence for several more minutes. I watched his hands move with practiced precision, adjusting his tools based on feedback I couldn't feel or hear. Finally, I heard a soft click. Got it, he said simply. We both stared at the trunk. Now that it was open, neither of us seemed eager to lift the lid. It was like Schrodinger's cat. As long as we didn't look inside, it could contain anything. Once we opened it, the possibilities would collapse into a single reality. You want to do the honors? Tommy asked. I reached for the lid, then hesitated. What if it's something illegal, stolen property or something? Then we put the lid back down and forget we were ever here, Tommy said matter-of-factly. But Mark, you bought this at a legitimate auction. Whatever's inside, it's legally yours now. I took a deep breath and lifted the heavy wooden lid. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The trunk was lined with faded velvet, and nestled inside were bars. Rectangular metal bars, each about the size of a paperback book but much thicker. They were tarnished and dull, but even in the workshop lighting, I could see the telltale gleam of gold. Holy shit, Tommy whispered. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up one of the bars. It was incredibly heavy, probably 2 or 3 pounds, and definitely gold. I could see markings stamped into the surface, numbers and letters I couldn't quite make out. How many are there? Tommy asked, his voice barely audible. I counted carefully, lifting each bar to see the ones underneath. 24 bars in total, arranged in neat rows like expensive books. Each one felt identical in weight and size. Tommy, I said, my mouth suddenly dry, I think these are gold bars. I think you're right. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at what had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of precious metal, maybe more. I'd never seen actual gold bars before, but these looked genuine, heavy, dense, and stamped with what appeared to be assayer's marks. Who the hell stores gold bars in a rented storage unit? Tommy asked. It was a good question, and one that immediately made me nervous. People didn't just forget about this kind of treasure. Someone had put these bars in this trunk for a reason, locked them away, and hidden them among mundane household goods. But who? And why? We need to be smart about this, I said, carefully replacing the bar I'd been holding. If these are real— Oh, they're real, Tommy interrupted. I've seen enough gold to know the difference. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I closed the trunk lid, my mind racing. What was I going to do? I'd gone to that auction hoping to find a few $100s worth of antiques to sell. Instead, I'd stumbled onto what might be the greatest treasure find in Phoenix history, and I hadn't told a single soul about it. Tommy left an hour later, $200 richer, and sworn to secrecy. But I could see in his eyes the same mixture of excitement and fear that was churning in my own gut. Before he walked out, he'd helped me move the trunk into my old floor safe, a 1950s Mosler I'd bought years ago to store my most valuable inventory. You're going to want to get those assayed, were his parting words. Find out exactly what you're dealing with. Now I sat alone in my workshop, staring at the safe that contained what might be my entire future. I'd done some quick math based on the weight and size of the bars. If they were pure gold, and the professional-looking stamps suggested they were, I was looking at roughly 48 pounds of precious metal. At current gold prices, that was somewhere north of $1 million. $1 million. The number kept bouncing around in my head like a pinball. I'd never even seen that much money, let alone owned it. My entire net worth, including the shop and my meager savings, was maybe $50,000 on a good day. I tried to focus on the practical questions. Where had the gold come from? The storage unit had belonged to someone named Eleanor Hartwell, according to the auction paperwork. The unit had been delinquent for 18 months, meaning she'd stopped paying rent sometime in early 2023. But the gold looked much older than that. The bars were tarnished in a way that suggested decades of storage. I spent the next 2 hours researching Eleanor Hartwell online. Phoenix Public Records showed she'd died in March 2023 at the age of 87. Her obituary was brief, survived by no immediate family. A long-time resident of Phoenix who'd worked as a bookkeeper for various businesses. No mention of wealth or precious metals, but people didn't usually advertise their gold holdings in obituaries. My phone rang, startling me out of my research. The caller ID showed my ex-wife Sarah's number. We'd been divorced for 3 years, but we still talked occasionally, usually about business. She was a real estate agent, and sometimes referred clients who were downsizing and needed to sell antiques. "Hey Mark, how's business?" "Oh, same as always," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Bought some interesting pieces at auction yesterday." "Anything good?" I looked toward the safe. Too early to tell. Still sorting through everything. Sarah knew me well enough to detect when I was holding back, but she didn't press. We chatted for a few more minutes about mutual friends and her latest real estate deals. After I hung up, I realized how difficult it was going to be to act normal around people who knew me. The weight of this secret was already changing how I interacted with the world. That evening, I drove home to my apartment with a head full of questions and possibilities. I lived in a modest one-bedroom place in Tempe, about 15 minutes from the shop. It was nothing fancy, basic furniture, a small kitchen, books everywhere, but it was mine, or at least the lease was mine. But now, suddenly, I could afford something better, much better. I could pay off the shop mortgage, buy a house, maybe even retire early. The possibilities were intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I made dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, the same meal I ate 3 nights a week, and tried to watch television. But I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every few minutes my mind would drift back to those 24 bars sitting in my safe. Were they really worth $1 million? More. And what was I supposed to do with them? I couldn't just walk into a gold dealer and try to sell 48 pounds of precious metal without raising questions. That kind of transaction would require documentation, background checks, possibly federal reporting. I'd need to prove where the gold came from, show that I'd acquired it legally, which I had, of course. I'd bought the storage unit fair and square, following all the proper procedures. But try explaining that to the IRS or whoever else might get interested in a small-time antique dealer suddenly flush with gold bars. Around 11 p.m., I gave up trying to sleep and drove back to the shop. The strip mall was deserted, lit only by a few security lights and the neon glow from the pizza place's sign. I let myself into the shop and went straight to the safe. The gold bars were still there, of course, arranged exactly as I'd left them. In the LED workshop lighting, they looked somehow more real than they had during the day. I picked up one of the bars and turned it over in my hands, studying the stamps and markings. The numbers were clearer now that I knew what to look for. Each bar was marked with what appeared to be an assayer's stamp, weight measurements, and a purity rating. These weren't some kind of novelty items or replicas. They were genuine, professionally refined gold bars. But as I examined them more closely, I noticed something else. One of the bars had additional markings that the others didn't, small letters and numbers that looked like they might be some kind of serial number or tracking code. I pulled out my phone and took several high-resolution photos of the markings. A quick Google search revealed that professional gold bars often carried tracking information that could be traced back to their source. Banks, investment companies, and government mints all maintained records of the precious metals they processed. If these bars had come from a legitimate source, there might be a paper trail. That thought both excited and worried me. A paper trail could prove the gold was legally acquired, which would make it easier to sell, but it could also lead back to Eleanor Hartwell or whoever had originally owned it. What if the gold was supposed to go to heirs who didn't know it existed? What if it had been stolen decades ago and stashed in that storage unit? I carefully returned all the bars to the safe and locked it up. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd start making some discreet inquiries. There had to be someone in Phoenix who could help me understand what I was dealing with, someone who knew about precious metals and could guide me through the legal and practical issues. But as I drove home through the empty streets, one thought kept nagging at me. In all my excitement about finding the gold, I'd been thinking about it as my discovery, my lucky break. But somewhere out there, Eleanor Hartwell had died thinking her secret was safe, locked away in a storage unit that no one else knew about. What had she planned to do with that gold? Had she been saving it for someone specific? And most importantly, had I just stolen a dead woman's final gift to the world? The questions followed me home and kept me awake until dawn. By morning, I'd made a decision that would determine everything that came next. I was going to find out who Eleanor Hartwell really was, and why she'd hidden a fortune in gold bars among old furniture and forgotten memories, even if the answer changed everything. The Phoenix Public Library's genealogy section wasn't exactly bustling at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, but that suited me fine. I'd spent most of the morning researching Eleanor Hartwell, and what I'd found was both fascinating and troubling. Eleanor May Hartwell had lived in Phoenix for over 60 years. She'd moved there from Chicago in 1962, shortly after her husband's death in an industrial accident. No children, no close relatives, just a quiet woman who'd worked as a bookkeeper for several small businesses throughout her career. On paper, she looked like exactly the kind of person who would die alone and forgotten, leaving behind a storage unit full of mundane possessions. But the more I dug, the more questions arose. Property records showed that Eleanor had owned her home free and clear, a modest bungalow in central Phoenix that she'd paid off in 1978. Her tax records showed steady but unremarkable income throughout her working years. She'd never owned expensive cars, never taken exotic vacations, never displayed any signs of unusual wealth. So where had she gotten enough money to acquire nearly $1 million worth of gold? I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't notice the woman approaching until she cleared her throat. I looked up to see a librarian, probably in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help but notice you're researching Eleanor Hartwell." I knew her. My heart skipped a beat. "You knew Eleanor?" "For about 15 years. We were in the same book club." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Chen, head librarian here. Eleanor and I, well, we weren't close friends exactly, but we talked fairly regularly." I introduced myself, explaining that I was an antique dealer who'd bought Eleanor's storage unit and was trying to learn more about her background. It was mostly true, just missing the crucial detail about the gold. "Eleanor was a very private person," Margaret said, settling into the chair next to me. "But over the years she let slip little details about her life. Would you mind if I asked why you're so interested? Most people who buy storage units just want to sell whatever they find." I had to be careful here. "I found some personal items, photos, documents, and I thought maybe there were family members who'd want them, but I can't seem to locate any relatives." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like Eleanor. She always said she was the last of her line, but..." She hesitated. "There was something she mentioned once about having money put away for when the time was right. I always assumed she meant her savings, but she said it in a way that made me think there was more to it." "What kind of more?" "I'm not sure, but Eleanor lived through the Depression. People from that generation sometimes prepared differently for hard times. They didn't always trust banks the way we do." My pulse quickened. "Did she ever mention storing things in a storage unit?" "Not specifically, but she did say once that she kept her insurance policy somewhere safe. I thought she meant actual insurance papers, but now..." Margaret trailed off, studying my face. "Mr. Thompson, did you find something unusual in Eleanor's storage unit?" I was walking a tightrope now. Margaret seemed genuinely caring about Eleanor's memory, but I couldn't risk revealing the truth about the gold. "Not yet. Some old financial documents," I said vaguely. "Nothing major, but it got me curious about her background." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "There's something else. Eleanor's husband, the one who died in Chicago. I looked him up once out of curiosity. Robert Hartwell worked for Brinks." "The armored car company?" "Exactly. He was killed in an attempted robbery in 1962, made the newspapers. It was a big story at the time. 3 armed men tried to hijack a Brinks truck, carrying payroll money to several banks. Robert was one of 2 guards who died defending the shipment." My mind raced. A Brinks guard killed in a robbery attempt in 1962. Eleanor moving to Phoenix shortly afterward, with enough money to buy a house. And now, 60 years later, gold bars hidden in a storage unit. "Do you remember any other details about the robbery?" "Not much. Eleanor only talked about it once, and she was clearly still upset, even after all those years. But I remember her saying that Robert had always been careful about money, always planning for their future together. After he died, She said she had to make sure his preparations weren't wasted. We talked for a few more minutes, but Margaret couldn't provide any additional details about Eleanor's finances or Robert's death. As I prepared to leave, she handed me a small piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "This is Eleanor's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. She looked after Eleanor's house during the last few years, brought in mail, that sort of thing. She might know something more." I thanked Margaret and left the library with my head spinning. A Brinks guard killed defending a shipment, a widow who moved across the country and somehow acquired enough wealth to live comfortably for 60 years without working a high-paying job. Gold bars hidden in a storage unit. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't a picture I liked. That afternoon, I drove to Eleanor's old neighborhood and found Mrs. Rodriguez. She was a cheerful woman in her 70s who invited me in for coffee and seemed delighted to have someone to talk to about Eleanor. "Such a sweet lady," Mrs. Rodriguez said as she poured coffee into mismatched mugs. "Very quiet, very private, but always kind. She helped me with my taxes every year. She was so good with numbers." The librarian mentioned that Eleanor might have had some money saved up. "Did she ever seem wealthy?" Mrs. Rodriguez laughed. "Eleanor? Wealthy? Oh no. She lived very simply. Same old car for 15 years, shopped at thrift stores, grew her own vegetables. The only thing she ever spent money on was books." That matched what I'd already learned, but it also deepened the mystery. How do you live frugally for 60 years while sitting on a fortune in gold? Did she ever mention having valuables stored somewhere? "Well," Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated. "There was one thing. About 6 months before she died, Eleanor asked me to help her carry some boxes to her car. Heavy boxes. She said they contained old books she was donating. But the boxes were so heavy and they made a strange noise when we moved them. Not like books, more like..." She made a clinking sound with her spoon against the coffee mug. "Like that." My heart started pounding again. "Did you see where she took them?" "To that storage place on Indian School Road. She rented a unit there, said she was finally cleaning out her house. But she only went there that one time, as far as I know. After that, she got sick pretty quickly." I left Mrs. Rodriguez's house with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty about what had happened. Eleanor Hartwell had possessed those gold bars for decades, probably since her husband's death in 1962. In her final months, knowing she was dying with no heirs, she'd moved them to storage, perhaps hoping someone worthy would eventually find them, or perhaps just unable to decide what else to do with them. But that still didn't answer the biggest question. Where had the gold originally come from? As I drove back to my shop, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I was going to drive to Chicago and dig into the 1962 Brinks robbery that had killed Robert Hartwell. I needed to understand what had really happened that day and whether the gold bars in my safe were connected to it. Because if they were, if Eleanor had somehow ended up with stolen gold from that robbery, then I wasn't just dealing with a lucky find at a storage auction. I was dealing with evidence from a 60-year-old crime, and that changed everything. The truth was waiting for me in Chicago. I just hoped I was ready for what I might find. The flight to Chicago gave me 3 hours to think about what I was doing. I'd left the shop closed for the day, told my few regular customers I was visiting family, and booked a same-day round trip to O'Hare. In my carry-on bag were photocopies of all the documents I'd found related to Eleanor Hartwell, plus high-resolution photos of the gold bars and their markings. I still wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew I couldn't move forward with the gold until I understood its origins. The Chicago History Museum's archives were more extensive than I'd hoped. The 1962 Brinks robbery had indeed been a major story, front page of the Chicago Tribune for 3 days running. As I read through the newspaper accounts, a clearer picture began to emerge. On March 15, 1962, 3 armed men had attempted to hijack a Brinks armored truck, carrying payroll funds to several major employers on Chicago's South Side. The truck was carrying approximately $400,000 in cash, worth several million in today's money. 2 guards, Robert Hartwell and James Mitchell, had fought back against the robbers. The shootout lasted less than 5 minutes, but when it was over, both guards were dead, as was one of the robbers. The other 2 robbers had fled on foot, abandoning their getaway car but taking nothing from the truck. Police found the Brinks truck intact, its cargo undisturbed, or so they thought. I found the detail I was looking for in a follow-up article published a week after the robbery. Brinks had conducted a complete audit of the truck's contents and discovered that while the cash payroll was intact, a separate shipment was missing. The truck had also been carrying a consignment of gold bars being transferred between banks, 24 1-kilogram bars worth approximately $35,000 at 1962 prices. My hands trembled as I read the description. 24 bars, exactly the number I'd found in Eleanor's trunk. The gold had never been recovered. The official investigation concluded that the robbers must have taken it during the brief firefight, though how they'd managed to carry nearly 50 pounds of gold while fleeing on foot had never been explained. The case remained unsolved, the gold presumed lost. But now I knew the truth. Somehow Robert Hartwell had managed to hide those gold bars before the robbers could get them. Maybe he'd passed them to Eleanor during the chaos, or maybe she'd found them later in his personal effects. Either way, she'd kept them secret for 60 years, living modestly while sitting on a fortune that legally belonged to the insurance company that had paid the claim in 1962. I spent another hour in the archives, reading everything I could find about the aftermath of the robbery. Eleanor had indeed left Chicago shortly after Robert's funeral, claiming she couldn't bear to stay in the city where her husband had died. She'd sold their small house and moved to Phoenix to start over. What she'd really done was disappear with nearly $1 million worth of gold in today's values. The flight back to Phoenix was turbulent, matching my churning thoughts. I'd gone to Chicago looking for answers, and I'd found them. But the answers raised new questions that were even more complicated than the original mystery. The gold in my safe was stolen property, or had been 60 years ago. The original theft claim had long since been paid, and everyone involved was dead. The insurance company that had covered the loss had probably been bought and sold multiple times over the decades. From a legal standpoint, the statute of limitations on the theft had expired decades ago. But from a moral standpoint, the situation was murky. Eleanor had lived with this secret her entire adult life. She'd known the gold was stolen, had known that keeping it meant depriving others of what was rightfully theirs. But she'd also known that her husband had died protecting that shipment, had given his life trying to stop the robbery. In her mind, maybe keeping the gold was a way of ensuring that Robert's sacrifice meant something. Or maybe she'd just been too scared to turn it in, afraid of being prosecuted as an accessory after the fact. I'd never know Eleanor's real motivations, but now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge and the gold. The smart move, the safe move, would be to quietly sell the gold and say nothing about its origins. The crime was ancient history. Everyone involved was dead, and I'd acquired the bars legally through the storage auction. I could retire comfortably, maybe buy a bigger shop, live the kind of life I'd always imagined but never thought I could afford. But as I sat in my workshop that evening, looking at the safe that contained my golden future, I kept thinking about Robert Hartwell. He'd died at 28, trying to do his job and protect other people's money. He'd never had the chance to enjoy the comfortable retirement that his widow had bought with the gold he'd died defending. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls that would determine the rest of my life. The first call was to a lawyer who specialized in historical property claims. The second was to an investigative journalist who'd written about cold cases involving stolen valuables. The third was to the current corporate successor of the insurance company that had paid the 1962 Brinks claim. By noon, I'd set in motion a process that would eventually return the gold bars to their rightful owners, or at least to the modern corporate entities that had inherited the claim. It would take months of legal wrangling, documentation, and probably a small army of lawyers, but I was going to do the right thing. The insurance company's current executives were amazed. Cold case recoveries of this magnitude were virtually unheard of, especially with such clear documentation of the original theft. They promised a substantial finder's fee, not nearly as much as keeping the gold would have been worth, but enough to pay off my shop mortgage and maybe take that vacation I'd been putting off for 5 years. As I write this, 6 months later, the legal process is still ongoing. The gold bars are being held in a bank vault while various parties sort out the details. I've been interviewed by police historians, insurance investigators, and even a documentary filmmaker who wants to tell Eleanor and Robert Hartwell's story. I never got my $1 million, but I got something better. I got to sleep at night knowing I'd done the right thing. I got to honor the memory of a man who died doing his job and a woman who carried his secret for 60 years. And I got to prove to myself that some things are more valuable than gold. The funny thing is, returning the gold bars led to more business for my antique shop than keeping them ever would have. The publicity from the case brought in dozens of new customers, people who were impressed that I'd chosen honesty over wealth. My shop is busier now than it's ever been. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept quiet about the gold's origins. I'd be wealthy, certainly, but I'd also be living with the knowledge that my fortune was built on someone else's loss. Every time I spent that money, I'd be reminded of Robert Hartwell, who died trying to prevent exactly what I would have done. Eleanor Hartwell took her secret to the grave, but she also took the weight of that secret. I chose to put the weight down and walk away lighter, even if my bank account didn't reflect that choice. In the end, it turned out that some storage units really do contain junk, just not the kind you can see when you're looking in from the outside. The real junk was the moral compromise I would have had to live with. The real treasure was the ability to look at myself in the mirror and like what I saw. That's worth more than all the gold in Chicago.